Good evening, everyone. Tonight is a special regular session of the South Kingstown Planning Board. This will be followed by a work session at 7 p.m. The date is Tuesday, June 14, 2022. The time is 6 minutes past 6. The first item on our agenda is roll call. Susan Axelrod.
Here.
Joe Murphy.
Here.
Paul Jordan.
Here.
Peter DiStefano is absent. Robin Pothier.
Here.
And Maria Mack is here. We have no items on our consent agenda. We have no minutes from which to approve and no public hearings. We have one item only this evening, and it is the preliminary plan, major land development, comprehensive permit, Matunic Beach Road condominiums. The public hearing for this item was closed at the last meeting, and we have a draft before us that we will proceed to examine and comment upon. Jamie?
Madam Chair, just one quick correction. On your agenda, you do have two action items. You do have the Matunic Beach, and then also under
Yes,
F,
thank
the
you.
recommendation to council.
Recommendation.
So,
Thanks, Jamie.
thank you. So, Madam Chair, staff, as directed, worked with legal as well as the department staff to try to understand and review the discussion material shared by the planning board members, the application material, and the subject matter associated with the public hearings held on this application, and put all of that into a motion in a favorable manner as directed by the planning board members. You have that before you. That latest draft was solidified probably at 4 p.m. this afternoon. We can walk you through those changes between what was sent out late last evening and the changes you have before you in hard copy today. So if you bear with me for a moment, I'm going to pull that up electronically.
Thanks, Jamie.
And Maria, I can put that on the board if you would like to. If you give me a moment. Just bear with me, I'm bringing up the latest copy.
And just to be clear for board members, we received a draft motion in an email that Jamie sent last night, and we now have a hard copy of some updates to that motion. So we will want to be sure to go through it in a thorough fashion. We're just waiting for Jamie.
Yeah, so Madam Chair, I do have the motion on the screen as well as the members have hard copies, but just running quickly through some changes between what you may have seen late last evening and this afternoon is under the findings of facts and requested relief. As we go down to conditions of approval, there was going backwards. under findings of fact, item F, there will be no significant negative impacts on the health, safety, and current or future residents. Council has advised staff that that language is no longer pertinent as it relates to case law associated with comprehensive permits, and Amy can expand upon that in a moment. Under findings of facts and relief requested.
Jamie, can we just go through one section at a time?
Yeah, absolutely.
I
Okay.
think that'll be easier for everyone.
Okay.
They're looking at things.
Sorry.
So, Amy, if you could explain the change under findings to item.
Oh, yes, okay. Some of the board members, or although maybe only Maria and Joe may remember, several years ago, the Larchwood Inn project came before the board, and the board denied the master plan application on a couple grounds. One of those grounds was that it didn't meet, in the board's view, one of the required findings in our regulations. On appeal, the Superior Court reversed the board's denial, and the court, and this came out in 2017, I think, the court said that that finding in our regulations, the finding denoted as F, which is redlined here, was not authorized by state law. So state law, the Development Review Act, sets forth the required findings for all land developments and subdivisions. South Kingstown, at some point, I don't know when, added an extra finding in its regulations. So that finding under that Superior Court decision is not authorized. I'm not sure if we've included it in any of our decisions since then. I know I gave the advice back in 2017 to former Director of Planning Chelsea Seifert. I may have neglected to bring that memo to Jamie's attention recently, but in any event, that's why I took that finding out, because even though it's in our regulations, we should consider it stricken.
And Amy, just as a matter of interest, what would it take to make that language codified as part of our regulatory?
It would take approval by the General Assembly for either South Kingstown specifically or for any other municipality to adopt this as an additional required finding in their subdivision regulations. Right now, we don't have that authority because the required findings set forth in state law are an enumerated list.
And the issues that are stated in this, are those able to be put in, for example, as a preamble of sorts to conditions, perhaps similar to the paragraph on page 2? Is that something that we can add, since those are all considerations that this board has made and questions that have been asked of the applicant?
I would be hesitant to include it anywhere in the decision based on that Superior Court precedent. I don't want the board to be accused of overstepping its legal authority. I will say that, some of the aspects of that required finding are, of course, addressed through the other findings.
Thanks, Amy. Questions on this from anyone?
I would ask then, where is items like adequate surface water runoff included?
So that would just be under finding number E, no significant negative environmental impacts.
So E's okay, but F's not. I'm a little lost as to...
Yeah, it's the statute, and I can pull up the specific provision of the Development Review Act. Give me just 1 minute. It's Title 45, Chapter 23, subsection 60. So 45-23-60 of the Development Review Act. states in pertinent part that local regulations shall provide planning board shall make positive findings on the following standard provisions. And items 1 through 5 are listed. So there are only 5 findings that planning boards must make with regard to projects that come before it, land developments and subdivisions. So to the extent that the town had in the past assessed projects against an additional required finding, we can't continue to do that.
So if I were to say that a proposal lacks, provision of emergency services, I just need to list that under item E? I can still point out that specific detail?
Yeah, so I would say this, that specific finding with emergency services would be addressed through the findings required by the LMI Housing Act. So not only is this a land development project, it's also a comprehensive permit application. So the board has to make certain findings to approve it as a land development project, additionally certain findings as to approve it as a comprehensive permit. And I know health and safety is a required finding under the LMI Act.
So where would we see that in our necessary findings? Where would that prompt be for us? Or any of the items in the crossed out F list?
So, Madam Chair, Robin, is your question specific to provision of emergency services?
No, it's I'm saying, that's a useful list of things for a board to consider. You take all that away and you leave E, which is quite vague.
Very vague.
Vague, yeah.
Very vague, yes.
So that was my question, and it's probably more for a work session than this particular permit, but that question about significant negative environmental impacts could be anything or nothing. I mean,
And harder to defend.
I have to apologize. I reviewed this quickly this afternoon. I have to, this finding of fact does come from the LMI Housing Act. When I reviewed this very quickly, so I apologize. Trying to do too much in one day. This finding of fact should be reinstated to the decision because the template does come from the LMI Housing Act. So
That's great.
everything that I said in the last 5 minutes, you can erase it from.
Yeah, Madam Chair, item F, instead of being proposed to be deleted, stands as written.
And we have certainly addressed throughout this process for this particular project the health and safety of current and future residents. So that's reassuring.
So can I just clarify, if this is part of the LMI Act, if this were a project that was not a comprehensive permit, isn't that also, though, something that we review? And does that mean that's not adequate for those other projects?
The statutes are very similar, the required findings from the LMI Housing Act and the required findings from the regular Land Development Review Act, which is why, again, looking at this very quickly, the language jumped out at me. So that required finding is not phrased as such in the Development Review Act, but what it relates to is covered in those required findings for the standard or conventional applications.
Thank you.
So again, Madam Chair, just for clarity on Susan's, there are a number of things you consider when evaluating a development proposal. And then there is specific language that gets included in motions. So there are things you are considering and have considered in your development review as it relates to the regulations, and then we have specific language associated with the motion. So in that scenario, Susan, if council's saying you shouldn't have that exact wording in there, you're still considering a number of those factors, to Mr. Jordan's point, as you contemplate environmental impacts, which include stormwater and runoff and other items.
Thanks.
Very good. Let's move on to page 2. Findings of fact, requested relief.
So with regards to findings of fact and affected relief, we had no changes through K on that. Our next changes were during conditions of approval. And again, Madam Chair, just in the first statement, I'll just read it aloud because it may be clear. So, conditions of approval. In attaching these conditions, the Planning Board recognizes that there are a myriad of policy documents, research, and scientific studies that exist at the local, i.e., South Kingstown Hazardous Mitigation Plan, South Kingston's Comprehensive Plan, state and federal level, i.e. climate change, sea level rise, which attempt to address climate change along with sea level rise as it relates to the new development along and near our shorelines. As a Planning Board, we also recognize that the majority of these policies and studies have not resulted in any significant regulatory changes at the local and/or state level, and that as a Planning Board, we are bound to review the application under the regulatory framework that exists within the town of South Kingstown and the state of Rhode Island. Although we may appear somewhat hesitant about the total impacts of this development may have on the community as a whole, we fully understanding that permitting parameters that must be weighed under the state of Rhode Island's comprehensive permit application process associated with affordable housing and the parameters associated with the design of development stormwater systems. So again, the intent of staff's recommendation on that language is to solidify perhaps the understanding and feelings associated with the Planning Board members as it relates to policy versus regulatory authority as you weigh this development proposal.
Jamie, I do have a couple of things that I would suggest, and I'm sure others may as well, other than little picky things like capitalized state and federal. In the, let's see, the first sentence where it says, which attempt to address climate change along with sea level rise as it relates to new, I would just add an existing development along or near our shorelines, because that's relevant both from the perspective of current and future residents and sea level rise, climate change as a whole.
So, Madam Chair, so as it relates to existing and new development?
To new and existing development, yes. And then I think the language in the last sentences that starts with, although we may appear, I think that can be stated in a more effective manner, the portion of the sentence that reads somewhat hesitant about the total impact. But those are my thoughts on that particular paragraph.
I would just add, Jamie, hazardous, South Kingstown's hazardous, typo there.
Yes, hazard. Yes. Thoughts?
Honestly, I'm trying to figure out exactly where you are on page 2.
At the top of the page.
No, the bottom of page 2.
That,
Bottom of page 2?
well, yeah, I'm looking at two different, yes.
Hang on.
Yeah, I do. I just didn't know where we were.
So it starts at the bottom of page 2 and then continues to page 3.
Madam Chair, hearing no other comments on that, I'll continue for the moment. And then,
Did anyone have thoughts about that sentence about we may appear somewhat hesitant about the total impacts that this development may have on the community as a whole, or is everyone fine with that?
What do you want to do to it?
I don't think we're hesitant about it. I think
Right, I
we're
don't think we're concerned.
we're concerned about our inability to address total or cumulative impacts that any development has, and that's an ongoing issue at the state level as well. You know, we look at developments parcel by parcel, but we don't consider cumulative impacts, development that could have happened 50 years ago.
So, Madam Chair, if I may,
I mean, it's primarily regarding negative environmental impacts.
so if you just bear with me a moment, I'll try and put some of those thoughts here as
So,
Five.
Maria, are you referring to an area being already past capacity?
All of
That's that type of document that,
yeah, all of those. And that's why I think the reference to our ordinances and regulations is important, because sea level rise, climate change, stormwater, all those things are specifically mentioned in the comprehensive plan, in the hazard mitigation plan, in the Matunic Village master plan. And I think it's important to reference those things so that there is no question about why we have these following conditions of approval.
right?
So it's an explanation or a justification, particularly since this is a comprehensive permit, as it relates to the following conditions. And I think it's important for us to state that.
It is beyond carrying capacity.
So I think if I were writing this, my wording would be a little stronger. Although we may appear somewhat hesitant, for me, is a little wishy-washy. And if I were writing it, I would say, although I am concerned about the total cumulative environmental impacts. I don't know if we can write that, but we may appear somewhat hesitant. I don't know. I got a little.
Yeah, you're right. It's
I got a little more to say than that.
So you said, although we are concerned about the,
Yeah, like I would get rid of the maze and
Yes.
whatnots and just be like,
Potential.
although we are concerned about, is the way I would word it.
Yeah, we're not hesitant. We're
Yeah, I'm not hesitant.
concerned.
We know how we feel.
No, I think that's reasonable, although we are concerned about the total cumulative impacts of this development may have on the community as a whole. We fully understand the permitting parameters
Yeah, we are
that
constrained.
you're evaluating this.
parameters, right? Did you change that?
Yes, I did.
Okay,
Yep.
not perimeter.
That must be weighed under the State of Rhode Island comprehensive permit, capitalized permit. Application process associated with affordable housing.
Anything else on this section? All
The-
right, go on to the next paragraph that, just before the conditions.
So again, in some initial language we submitted to you last month, there was discussion about intent or the ability to construct this project. So we just modified this language slightly to read, to the extent that such conditions may render the project infeasible as a business venture, the board finds that the local concerns in imposing the same outweighs the potential benefits of affordable units that have been proposed, and that said conditions are consistent with the local needs. So in essence, it may have read slightly confusing when it just said projects infeasible. It's not that you're adding conditions to a project that you don't determine whether it's infeasible or not. The applicant doesn't necessarily determine it's infeasible or not as an economic standpoint. It's a business venture he's undertaking as an application process, and you still feel that the conditions you're attaching are necessary to protect the environment as it relates to proposed development, and if that affects the business venture, it still outweighs the need for affordable housing in the community.
Can we just eliminate the part about to the extent that such conditions may render the project infeasible as a business venture and just start with the board finds that the local concerns, et cetera?
I defer to
I don't
counsel.
remember, it just seems odd to be talking about a business venture in a motion.
Aren't they all business ventures?
Right, but still, we generally,
So Maria, you're suggesting the highlighted text is just removed and you start the sentence, the board finds that.
That is perfectly fine.
is everyone okay with that?
Correct me if I'm wrong, but not that I spend a lot of time reading the zoning code, but I thought that zoning variances and whatnot couldn't be based on economic need or...
The standards, the normal standards for variances, which you're right, can't be for financial gain, go out the window for comprehensive permits.
Okay.
Yep.
Right, okay.
Okay,
Again, the language after that change is the 12 units, 25%, 3 units affordable. We go down to page 4, where item number 14, where we talk about the development and necessary development of the HOA and its need to incorporate a very clear and concise maintenance and inspection provision. And when we were looking at the motion, we felt the need to clarify who reviews that, and that would be the administrative officer in consultation with the town engineer and director of health. I will add legal counsel to that also.
I have a suggested change here. Particularly for this project, 5 years rather than 2 for the monitoring.
agreed.
And I don't know if there's a way to say it here. I think, part of this issue is people may report flooding, but if the flooding is a result of more frequent and more intense rainstorms, then that isn't. So it's going to be a difficult thing to address if and when neighbors are complaining that there's an increase in flooding. We would have to also look at.
Yep. So Mr. Jordan, I absolutely respect and understand the comment, and that's the difficulty in the monitoring.
Right.
I think it's clear on staff's behalf that the applicant is monitoring the performance of their storm improvements as it relates to the design criteria they used.
Right.
So
Okay.
they're using factors associated with a 25-year storm event, and it was designed for that.
Okay.
If a weir is overtopped in a 100-year storm, it was designed to be overtopped in a 100-year storm. It's really evaluating the design parameters associated with the structures they built. And, to your point, if there are 3 back-to-back 100-year storms in a 2-week period, it will be interesting to understand what the net effects of that are. But so long as they didn't exceed the design parameters and everything held up for those parameters, there would be no corrective action necessary or mandated.
And I think I also asked at a meeting a month or 2 ago if we could look at whether or not we have any authority to exceed state regulations regarding stormwater. We don't. Okay.
So are you saying 100-year instead of 25-year storms?
Yeah.
I mean, we really should be we all know there's going to be more and more rain. We really should be designing to those standards. Or your neighbors are going to be in a tough spot.
Jamie, a couple of questions. One is that I have in my notes from concerns from DPS where they stated that the engineer of record should be required to review stormwater improvements and confirm that they are operating as designed and not change the pre-development drainage pattern, in particular as it relates to the level spreader. Do you think that language should be in here, or is it assumed? I just want to make sure we don't leave anything out.
Yeah, I think, Madam Chair, I put condition number 16 up on the screen. The applicant shall be required to have the site's design engineer present during construction of the proposed stormwater infrastructure in order to perform periodic inspections. Once the improvements have been completed, the design engineer,
So that's relating
Yeah.
to that it was installed, but I'm talking about the functionality.
Well, installed per design as it relates to pervious, and then we have all of that there. The monitoring aspect relates back to the design.
So I have a question about this. I don't think I understand what periodic inspections mean, and it's kind of vague. Is that designed to be vague, or is that, I don't know what periodic inspections mean.
So there, yeah. So during construction, they may have a 6-month construction time frame, and during that 6 months, they may only be working on the basin infrastructure for a 1 or 2 week period. The engineer does not need to be there 14 hours a day, 7 days a week during that construction. There are critical points to that that will be covered in a pre-construction meeting with town staff on when those periodic inspections need to be done based on consultation with DPS and the town engineer as it relates to that. You know, I don't know if it's once a day, once a week, every third day, you know, but from my perspective, it's, you know, when the basin's been roughed out, someone should be determining that the organics are removed, that there's sufficient sub-base prepared. There should be inspection that goes in before the weir is placed, that compaction is sufficient before they pour concrete. So there are construction sequencing and inspections associated with that we would intend to go through during our mandatory pre-construction meetings.
It will be prescribed outside of this operation.
Yeah.
So I had that same question. Periodic is vague. It doesn't hold anybody to any particular schedule as needed. Should something be referenced, whether it's the pre-construction meeting with staff and so on, so that it's a little more clear and less vague and wouldn't prevent someone saying, well, it said periodic. I mean,
So I
You could always just put as determined by either the administrative officer and/or the director of public services.
staff, yeah. Is that better, Susan?
I didn't realize there was another operation outside of this that would prescribe what periodic meant, so I'm happy. So before we go on, can we just jump back to 15 for a minute? Did we change the 2 years to something else, or did we leave this at 2 years?
5.
Oh, awesome. Thank you.
I had a question on 19. Is it supposed to be surety rather than security?
it's financial security.
It's not surety as it relates to...
Financial security is a financial instrument to define a surety bond, irrevocable letter of credit,
Want to make
cash.
sure we haven't used that term to my knowledge in the past, and want to make sure we're talking about the correct item.
So just for clarity, Madam Chair, if I can just go back to 16, and again, administratively, we may wordsmith this for proper English. The applicant shall be required to have the site's design engineer present during construction as determined by the Director of Public Services in consultation with the town's administrative officer of the proposed water infrastructure in order to perform periodic inspections sufficient to determine compliance. So again, we may wordsmith that, but I think there's an understanding. It's the time needs to be spent on the inspections in a sufficient manner to determine compliance with the design parameters as it relates to the infrastructure improvements associated with stormwater management.
Anything else from board members on these conditions?
I had concern. I'm certainly good with the project. I mean, we were very thorough with the drainage, but I had concern whether to ensure that there's no future activity that either increases the amount of infrastructure or any more that would place any more impervious on the site. And I was hoping that we could, perhaps it would be between 1 and 2 here on the conditions of approval, but maybe have a deed restriction to prevent any future increase in square footage or increase in number of bedrooms in a development. So probably be a little stronger.
I don't see that as necessary, only because it's a given under the law and under our regulations that no changes can be made without planning board approval.
So if they wanted to put an addition on the structure 10 years from now, they would have to come back if they
Back to the
were gonna
planning
increase
board.
it at all?
Changes would be reviewed in accordance with the regulations, which does allow for minor changes with the approval of the administrative officer, and minor changes as defined in the regulations are kind of a short list. Major changes have to come before the board.
So this is different than a housing development where years later somebody wants to increase the size of their house. In this case, they would not be able to do that.
Yeah, Joe, to your point, this is different than a subdivision where you're approving, 20 individual lots. Someone buys a lot, builds a 3,000 square foot colonial and decides to add a family room. They would just go back to the zoning board. Because this is being approved as a major land development, multi-household development on a single parcel, you are approving a very specific footprint.
All right, so
I mean,
cannot
from
be
my
an increase in
perspective-
the parking or
Yeah.
an additional structure to house summer gear or any of that, they wouldn't be able to
From my perspective as the planning director, who also functions as the administrative officer, if they propose to put another paved parking space, I would advise them that requires an amendment to a previously approved plan, and it needs to go through the same approval process that the original plan was followed. So if it was a public hearing like this was, to add a parking space, public hearing, notice to the neighbors, redo your stormwater calculations, redo your impervious surface calculations, back to the planning board. As your administrative director, I will tell you today that I would not sign off on a parking space or an addition. If someone did a trash lean-to on, off the side of a building that's 5 by 5, and the water, instead of falling where Paul sits, falls where my laptop is, and it has no net effect on impervious surface or stormwater, I may find, the liberty to sign off on a small revision to that. But parking spaces, footprint, someone proposes to do a stone patio or a stamped concrete patio versus a pervious deck. In my view, that would come back to you.
Okay, so that satisfies that. Then the only other thing I would ask, is it possible for us to put a condition of approval that during construction, water-efficient fixtures be used? So that'd be obviously the commode, the shower, the faucets, all that type of stuff, just to minimize the amount of water that's injected into the ground at that site.
During construction,
Yeah, that'd be part of the construction, is water-efficient fixtures be utilized.
Yeah, I would. I want to say fixtures, low-flow toilets are, from my perspective, the norm in the building industry. I don't know if we have the ability on the zoning or planning review side to dictate the type of fixture within the unit. But I'll defer to council.
And the reason would, I mean, I can kind of guess the reason, but what would the reason? I think you can require it if you want to.
Or
it should be part of what Jamie referred to earlier as the pre-construction meeting and the requirements in that conversation.
I would be in favor of that as well because it goes to cumulative impacts.
What I potentially would do or advise you is to have language in your conditions that said it is recommended that the fixtures associated with these units are low flow. Again, the septic systems that are on site are designed to handle that bedroom flow and bedroom count. So DEM's approving it, so I think you could make a strong recommendation.
The septic systems are designed to treat the water. The water's still going into the ground, so anything that you do to reduce that flow.
Right. So again, and I'll look for potentially a spot to put that in.
People feel, I don't necessarily like the word recommended. If we have the responsibility to try to minimize the impacts, then that's a responsibility, not a recommendation. Recommendation, I don't think we fulfill a responsibility.
Right. I agree.
It's just my thought.
It's water quantity, not necessarily water quality that we're addressing here. And often those two items are not well understood. So I think this speaks directly to quantity.
And again, I don't think it's really much of an impact to the developer since they're pretty standard anyways.
So I don't think we have an existing category within the conditions to add it to one of those, so it, in essence, would be a standalone. And
Well, under environmental impact, perhaps?
just bear with me, I'm just looking for a good spot to put that in. I would, after 12, where we talk about infrastructure improvements associated with underground utilities, I would just add 13.
Well, that works, as long as it's stronger than a recommendation, because it's a waste of ink.
Again, just understand that this becomes a item that is extremely difficult to regulate over time. So, okay.
You need a T at the beginning of that sentence?
It's hidden on the top right, Robin.
Okay.
The uniqueness of words sometimes. It does that. Sorry.
So Jamie, I have a couple of things too. Joe, are you done? Okay. So back on the conditions of approval number 3, it says the LMI units will be sold to households. And then on number 7, it says, and draft lease agreements for any rental units that require affordability. Are we, in both of those cases, referring to our LMI units, but yet 7 suggests there may be some leases and rental agreements? I believe that all of these units are planning to be sold, so that so number 3 looks good, but then 7 refers to rentals and leases.
I think the intent there is that in the advent that one of the units became rental, that there was still a requirement for a monitoring agreement.
But they are required to be owner-occupied, yes?
Yes. Yep.
With it. Can we strike that, Amy? Again, I'll defer to council.
As the board, and I thought this discussion had occurred, as the board, on any application involving LMI units, the developer will tell you whether or not they want to do rental units, for sale units, or some combination. And you, as the board, can require the developer to, you can hold the developer to one of those options. So if the application was for sale units, you can require that they be for sale units. At some point, if the developer or subsequent owners want to rent the units, they would need board approval.
I think, having just listened to the 4-hour tape today, that Jay brought this up at the last meeting, and, extreme circumstance where I'm called away, I need to leave the state for 6 months, and I don't want to give up my home, but I do want to rent it out for 6 months or a year while I'm away, and I don't think we want to prevent that.
I hear you there. I thought that was a good idea, but perhaps the language could speak to how a minimum of time it could be rented for, so it doesn't become a 1 or 2 week rental kind of.
Yeah, I think the bottom line there was just if it's an affordable unit, I buy it because I qualify to buy an affordable unit, and then I decide 5 years from now to rent it out to someone as an affordable unit. The town hasn't lost anything.
I just wanted to point out, I believe affordable rentals have to be rented on an annual basis. Oh. So that's a minimum requirement. And also, I know there's a lot of concern about places turning into student rentals. Students are not eligible for low, moderate income housing.
Any other comments on the conditions?
Yes.
Go ahead, Susan.
Okay, back up to number 3. I think there may be a typo unless I'm just reading it funny. A maximum of 100% of the area median income below 100% of the area median income. Is that simply a duplicate of the same statement?
Yes.
That was a typo last
Yes.
meeting as well.
So after AMI, it should just say, and be deed restricted for a period of 30 years.
Corrected.
So my last question, we never addressed in any of the conditions, any of the landscape requirements, and whether we wanted to have the landscape architect or the landscape designer on site during any of the plantings, and whether or not we're guaranteeing the survivability of any of the plantings and all kinds of things like that. Unless I've missed something, is that not one of our conditions?
There's condition number 17, the applicant shall be required to have the project landscape architect present during the installation of the plant material in order to perform periodic inspections. Once the installation of the plant material, including turf, has been completed, the design architect shall verify in writing that the material was installed as designed and approved. It doesn't say anything about the...
I missed that part about the landscape, so that's good.
And just for clarity, a lot of your prior motions stated that the landscape architect shall verify that the material was installed and designed in substantial compliance with. We've removed the terminology substantial compliance with because that's vague. And you, from my perspective, you either complied with the approved plans or you did not comply with the approved plans.
So does the administrative officer have the right to swap out plant material, and do we ask for a guarantee on how long, say, the privet hedge survives?
Our requirements contained in the subdivision regulations are a 1-year warranty from certificate of occupancy. It's not CO. So when the project is completely buttoned up and all the certificate of occupancies have been issued and the project is closed, it'd be a 1-year warranty from there. So in most instances, you're getting slightly over a year. You're getting, in some instances, 18 months to 24 months from completion of the project. So if Unit 1 is CO'd in 2024 and Unit 12 is CO'd in 2026, the 1 year goes from 2026. It's when the project is completed, not from installation.
And there is a note on the landscape section of the plans that state that any substitutions need to be okayed by the administrative officer.
Okay. So because the privet hedge is now the fence, the fence is gone, is 1 year enough? And do we have the ability to make that a little longer because it is the buffer to the whole Holden Road neighborhood? Or does it 1 year, you think, cover the health and survivability of that hedge?
Again, in my knowledge of construction and project management over the years, that privet hedge is not going to go in on the last day that they're seeking a certificate of occupancy for the 12th unit. So you, in essence, by construction sequencing, would get a little bit over 12 months. Our regulations are 12 months or 1 year. So you would be asking for something outside the perimeters of your regulatory authority.
Although it's 2 years on street trees.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So I think that's all of my questions, except at the last meeting, I challenged the landscape architect about what kind of privet he was putting into his plans, because privet's kind of vague and there's like 600 different species. So I've done a little research, and there's the really good privet and there's the really, really bad privet, which is a Rhode Island invasive. So I have some little notes, and I don't necessarily want to put it in as a condition, but I would like to share that, you know, common privet, and I have the Latin name here, is a Rhode Island invasive, and it'll be popping up in all the neighbors' gardens. But there are actually privets that we like. So I can share this with you or them, or as a condition or whatever, to definitely not put in the bad privet.
Again, we have testimony during the approval process that they will not be planting the invasive privet
Okay.
as it relates to Rhode Island.
Thank you.
Anything else on this motion? I do have a question. Why is the last sentence in this, and can it be stricken? It's inherently obvious.
Again, I will defer to counsel.
We usually put that notice of appeal, I want to say, for all decisions, so I would leave it in.
Don't recall that. I mean, is it required? Would that be in the? We all know full well that it can be appealed, but
It's not required.
okay. I think it's redundant, unnecessary. Everybody okay with that? If there is nothing else in terms of questions or modifications, would someone like to make the motion to the draft as amended?
I'll attempt that.
Thank you, Joe.
The South Kingston Planning Board hereby grants preliminary plan approval to Matunic Beach Road condominiums, a 12-unit major multi-household land development project submitted as a comprehensive permit containing 12 single-family dwelling units, with 8 of these units being market-rate housing and 3 so that's not actually right. It's 9, and it should be 9 and 9 and 3, right? So 9 of these units being market rate housing units, and 3 dwelling units being deed restricted for low or moderate income occupancy. Located on Matunic Beach Road, Matunic Beach Partners LLC, owner applicant. The approval is based upon plan set entitled Permitting Submission, Matunic Beach Condos, Matunic Beach Road, South Kingstown, Rhode Island, Assessors Plat 92-2, Lot 56, Sheet 1 through 14, dated July 1st, 2021, with revisions through February 17th, 2022, and May 11th, 2022, Sheets 11 and 12, prepared by Dupree Engineering, 2 Stafford Court, Cranston, Rhode Island, 02920. The approval is also based on the landscape plans entitled Landscape Plans, Matunic Beach Condominium, located at Piping Plover Drive, Assessors Plat 92-2, Lot 56, South Kingstown, Rhode Island, dated August 11th, 2021, with revisions through May 11th, 2022, prepared by John C. Carter Company, Inc., 960 Boston Neck Road, Narragansett, Rhode Island, with findings of fact A through H, and findings of fact requested relief first was A through G, and this is H through J. And conditions of approval with the introduction text or narrative edited as discussed tonight, and the conditions of approval 1 through 22 as discussed and slightly edited with discussion, as well as the additional condition of approval that low-flow fixtures be used during construction.
Madam Chair, just quick clarity. I believe that's items 1 through 23, Joe, because item 3 was added.
It was 1 through 22 plus the additional one
So a total of 23.
for the low fixture. Yes.
Thank you.
And under findings of fact requested relief was L, J, and K, just to make sure nothing is left out.
And just to Joe's last, about the low flow, just to be clear, they're not being used during the construction, they're being used in the construction. They're
We have a motion from Joe. Do we have a second?
second.
Second from Paul. Is there further discussion? I just wanted to make a brief statement that this was a very difficult and lengthy process with regard to this project, particularly because it was a comprehensive permit that would have been viewed significantly differently had it been a ordinary subdivision. It's a sensitive environmental site. It has the eastern and western portions are within a flood zone. It's designated as developed beyond carrying capacity per CRMC in the SAMP. Our comprehensive plan, our hazard mitigation plan, as referenced in the motion, speaks to sea level rise, climate change. This board has attempted to be as thorough as possible in terms of impacts of stormwater and flooding to current and future residents, thus the number of conditions in the motion. We understand that according to the Low Mod Act and the comprehensive permit process, if we were not to condition this and we were to deny this, it could be remanded back to the board with no conditions whatsoever. So out of an abundance of caution and an attempt at being as thorough as possible, I think the board has been as deliberate and thoughtful as they can be. Anyone else?
I just would say I want to thank the developer for agreeing to all of these concessions and listening to the neighbors. I think in this case, the developer is certainly not at fault. These are the rules that we have to work with, and it seems like as a planning board, we're really functioning more as permitting board. And obviously, we may need more work sessions to look at our regs and think about how we address some of these concerns in the future. I think we've seen a number of projects that we've had concerns about and had to approve regardless of our concerns because of the rules that are in place. And so I think that just becomes more important to think about what we want to change, what we need to change in the future.
Thank you, Paul. Anyone else?
I'd just say that comprehensive permits are always difficult. They're difficult because they put us in a position of balancing the need for housing against the impacts that it has on neighboring properties. I think that one of the things that's missing in our regulations is maybe something that slants that balance or tips that balance when we are, and gives us better direction when we're in an area that is developed beyond its existing capacity already. So in a case like this, I think we had a very difficult time balancing it, and I think if it was not a comprehensive permit, we might have tipped in the other direction, but maybe some additional regulations which prevent or decrease the amount of incentive when we're in an area that's already beyond its capacity, I think would be appropriate.
Thank you, Joe. Anyone else? Hearing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Motion carries. Thank you. Thank you. Next agenda item is a recommendation to the Town Council, draft amendments to the zoning ordinance relative to the third alternate member of the zoning board. Jamie?
Oh, yes.
So, Madam Chair, we were made aware by Town Council's legal team that there was an amendment to state law regarding the addition of a third member to the Zoning Board of Appeals. With that being said, there was an additional discussion that the law would supersede any amendment necessary for the town's ordinance or the town's charter. The opinion of that changed slightly, and the recommendation was made that there should be an amendment to the charter and the ordinance. So you have a handout that shows the change in the law, and then a recommended motion drafted in a favorable manner, making a recommendation to the council that the amendment to the zoning ordinance, as well as any necessary changes to the charter, be made to support the change in the law to add a third member to the Zoning Board of Appeals.
Thank you, Jamie. Amy, do you have anything to add to this?
No, nothing to add.
Questions?
So, Jamie, is it safe for me to assume that the zoning board members feel that this would be helpful for them to carry out their responsibilities?
Absolutely.
Yes.
We've had a number of quorum issues over the last few years, not as much as we would have with Zoom, right? Zoom, not everyone was necessarily at home in South Kingstown for meetings, but now you have to be. So absolutely, with the volume of zoning applications we have that doesn't seem to be slowing down anytime soon, yes, that will join a handful of other communities that also have state authorization to have 3 alternates on the zoning board.
Any other questions?
Well, so how often does the alternate get involved? How do they keep up with?
Frequently, the alternates would be expected to attend all the meetings, so that if a member can't make the continuation of an application, the alternate can step in and vote in their place.
I see. Thank you.
And again, Robin, even though they're alternates, typically in any public hearing process, they would be allowed to ask a question.
Okay.
Not deliberate on any motion, but ask a question in the event that they were seated. They wouldn't sit there and say, well, I need to abstain because I had a question, I wasn't allowed to ask it. But typically to ask a question during any hearing setting, but not deliberate or participate in any decisions or discussions with the board unless they were seated where they would have full privileges.
That's good.
If there are no further questions, would someone like to make the motion on the bottom of the page?
I'll make that motion. Planning Board recommends approval of the proposed amendment to Town's zoning ordinance by the Town Council to add a third alternate for the Zoning Board of Review. Planning Board also recommends approval of any proposed amendment to the town's charter that would be required to necessitate the utilization of a third alternate to the Zoning Board of Review.
We have a motion from Paul. Do we have a second? Second from Susan. Is there further discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Motion carries. This concludes our special meeting. If someone would like to make a motion to close the agenda, then we will move into our work session.
Can I make a request before we do?
Certainly.
So there were so many changes to that final motion for Matunic. Would you consider emailing that out to us just for our records because there were so many changes?
We will do that by the end of this week.
Awesome, thank you.
And that would also be located in the minutes that would come to us as well.
But sometimes those motions aren't actually in the minutes.
Should be.
Yeah. But having it would be good.
Motion to adjourn
So moved.
Second?
from Joe, second from Paul. All those in favor say aye.
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 Motion carries.
Madam Chair, if we can just take a brief recess before you enter into the meeting. As promised, we are providing food for you this evening since we brought you out early. We're also going to slightly rearrange the tables to be a more productive work session format. So thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you everyone for your patience who's interested in this subject matter tonight as members of the public. We have Horsley Witten and Union Studios here tonight to review where we are from a project perspective, how it relates to our regulations in town, and kind of a reminder of why we're sitting here tonight, why we undertook the study, where we've been, where we're going, and also answer some of the questions that have come out of our workshops about whether you call it concern, anxiety, fear of how the missing middle gets incorporated into the regulations as it relates to density, style, architecture. I think there's some comfort level with planning board members if you have one duplex or one estate mansion home, one stacked flats, but how does that interact with the neighborhood when there's a site where they're proposing 4 duplexes on one property, or 3 mansion homes, or 4 townhouses, or 32 duplexes? Not that I'm scaring you, but 32 duplexes, and the developer proposes to make every single one of the 32 duplexes look like the one to the left, the right, and across the street. So again, I've asked Jeff Davis to come in from Horsley Witten, and Jeremy Lake to come in from Union Studios, and Erica to come in also to, expand the discussion a little bit, and kind of in this kind of more relaxed, less formal setting of a normal planning board meeting, so we can have it interactive and discussion and lively. I know Jeremy's got a few slides, as well as Jeff Davis, to go through as far as where we've been and why we're here. So with that being said, I'll turn it over to Jeff to just kind of remind you of where we are and why we're here.
Yeah, thank you, Amy. So I will be brief because really Union Studio pulled together a great presentation that reminds us where we've been with our analysis of existing housing types in South Kingstown, and some of the regulatory work that we've done post the cottage zoning, of course, that you passed last year. We have taken some strides to develop similar regulations for the other missing middle housing types. And as Jeremy pointed out to me earlier, we don't want to call this missing middle once they're regulations, because they won't be missing anymore. So we have to come up with a different name for that, right? Next slide, please. So just wanted to take 5 minutes before, because I know we have a number of folks who were not on the planning board when we started this process, although I'm sure you're all very active and engaged residents throughout the process. But want to remind everyone why we're doing this and what we've already done to date. Next slide, please. So what were we trying to accomplish? So we started this, we were just thinking, Jeremy and I had our first meeting here in Town Hall in December 2018, and the charge we were given then was to make sure that South Kingstown is a place where people have access to homes that suit their needs at every age. So really looking at a diversity of housing that's going to meet the needs of young families, of people who are aging out of their single-family homes and looking for something to, a smaller alternative. So all sorts of types of housing for different stages of life. And then really looking at meeting the needs of everyone, again, young and old, people who live by themselves, people who live with large families or intergenerational situations, owners and renters. We had that conversation earlier today. There are needs for both. We need housing for the wealthy. We also need housing for the working class and the middle class. We need more independent and assisted living. We also know that you have a diversity of places, that you've got your village centers, your farms, your forests, your coasts, and that each of those has its own needs. So this is really about implementing the long-term values that you've had as a community. So we really wanted to emphasize that this was not new, that this has been your policy for literally decades to focus new housing development in and around your central villages to the extent that you can preserve your remaining agricultural, forest, and coastlands, to increase housing choices to meet those local needs that we were just discussing, and to better use your conservation and open space subdivisions to be more efficient with your land, and also to help meet your state goal of reaching 10% low and moderate income housing. So you have made progress over recent years. Just under 80% of the housing stock is single family, and this has been slowly trending down. However, most construction over the past 20 years or so have been single family. Rental homes are just under 30% of the housing stock now, 28%. This has actually trended down. You've lost some of your rental units as a percentage of your overall housing. And homes in central villages. So we've been trying to track where new development is happening. And your goal has been for new development to happen within the central villages. And so far, within, I think this statistic was 2019, 42% of homes have been built in the central villages, which is great. That's an improvement over 2004 when you only had about 40%. But still, almost half of new residential development is still taking place outside where you want it to occur. Your low mod percentage is currently about 5.6%. Cost burden is going up. In other words, people spending more than 30% of their incomes on housing. You're currently up to 28% of homeowners and 53% of renters. So most renters are cost burden now. It's becoming increasingly difficult for renters. But for over a quarter of your homeowners as well. And again, none of this is new. Housing prices are going up exorbitantly even since 2020. When I grabbed these numbers, if we were to look at the first quarter of 2022, things have gone up significantly, and the gap is continuing to widen between what people make and how much it costs to live here. So obviously the problem has only gotten worse since we started. And this is the last slide I'm going to show because this may be something that even people on the planning board may not recall. Early on in the process, we were asked to analyze what housing could be built at market rates that would be affordable for people's incomes in town. And essentially, the consultant team came back saying that literally the cost of construction is so high you cannot build residential rental housing cheap enough to support rents that the average person can afford. The cost of construction is just so high that if you want it to be affordable, it's going to have to be subsidized in some way. Found that the same was basically true for single-family homes, but there was still some opportunity at the time to build market-rate townhouses and multifamily that could come closer to a target that the average person could afford without some sort of subsidy. So I did want to bring that up again, just that there are certain things that building denser will help and for other issues, it's going to have to be a combination of building and subsidy, because building alone is not going to make things more affordable. So with that, you all should have received as well a link to the story map that we prepared for this project. I'm not going to go through that with you tonight, but really encourage everyone to look at that again. It was just a nice, I think, encapsulation of all these issues that I was just presenting, and we go village by village and talk about what are the opportunities here, what is the vision for these villages and the current plans that the town has, and what are some changes that could be made. I would also encourage you to go back and look at that survey from 3 years ago and the results, which I think surprised a lot of people, how open a number of folks in the community were to different housing types. Of course, when a proposal occurs in your backyard, that's when the issues arise. But in theory, in concept, a lot of these different housing types people were open to in a number of the different villages. So with that, I do want to turn it over to the team from Union Studio. Again, they're going to do a little bit of backward looking at what we've done so far with our analysis of different housing types, but also we've done some work that you have not seen yet on regulations for these other types of missing middle housing beyond cottage communities, and we hope that will spark a good discussion.
So I will quickly introduce myself. I'm Jeremy Lake with Union Studio. I'm a senior associate there. I've been there about 10 years. I head up the majority of our community design work, be it working with existing communities on design guidelines, whatever the case might be. But also when we do new neighborhood developments, a lot of that work ends up being on my shoulders. That said, I'm joined tonight by Erica Thornton, who's a colleague of mine who works with me on all of those projects as well. She's been involved with this project since the get-go, so I actually asked her to present the materials that we've done over the last 3.5 years as part of this project. I'll probably be interjecting from time to time with some color commentary, and certainly look forward to being a part of the conversation as well. So
I'll get started. Like Jeff said, I was...
Erica, just speak a little closer to the mic. That way everything can be recorded.
Okay. So like Jeff said, we're going to go back a little bit in time and look at the housing that currently exists in South Kingstown. And then we'll look at the visual guides that we're calling these visual guides that goes along with the zoning language that Horsley Witten has provided. And then we'll provide some case studies as well that looks at some just illustrative examples of missing middle housing in place.
Erica, if you can recognize the difference between speaking here and speaking here.
Okay. Got it.
Yeah.
All right, so the first part, what types of density and housing exists in South Kingstown already? This was sort of the charge, was to go and look out into the existing villages of South Kingstown and see what is there. Are there missing middle housing types currently? What's the density? So you can go to the next slide. So first we started looking at Kingston, Peacedale, and Wakefield. We did find a range of missing middle houses types in each village. And we used those then to go ahead and develop our design standards. So here's a map again of looking at we did a lot of these figure grounds just to look at the density and compare them to other areas. And so when we're talking about missing middle housing types, I know some of you have maybe reviewed this material already, but we're talking about that housing that's between the conventional single family and the multi-family apartment. So anything from your ADU up to a walk-up, which might be like the size of a small-scale multi-family house, multi-family.
And I will just interject, the reason we call it missing middle is because for a very long time, most zoning codes jumped from a single-family detached use category, maybe up to an R10 where it's a quarter-acre lot, up to multifamily, which might be starting at like 20 units to an acre. So they would cover 4 units to an acre, up to 20 units, below 4 or above 20. But the missing middle was all the stuff that we used to build that could slot in between those ranges, that could provide a little bit of density, but in a form that isn't jumping all the way up to what we think of when we hear multifamily, big buildings, corridors, elevators, the whole 9 yards. So I just wanted to interject that, that again, the concept here is how can we find a way of interjecting some density into some of these areas, but in forms that fit and are appropriate to the kind of context and scale of the villages that exist today.
So when we looked at the village of Kingston, you can see, even though this is probably the least dense of all the villages that we looked at, that there's actually a lot of housing that's right downtown and sort of the core of the neighborhood, the village there. And that's intermixed with a lot of the community anchors. So it's a really wonderful spot to live, a wonderful spot to have infill of different types of housing. And what we found...
So the red ones are the ones that we
Yes, thank you.
identified as some of these missing middle types and then quantified and documented to understand what they were.
And what we found with Kingston in particular was a lot of manor houses and walk-up types, probably because it's proximity to the university. So they're able to get a lot of housing right in something that looks like a large single-family house. If you go to the next slide, Jamie, you can see that we have this report that we can provide if needed, if you haven't been able to see that yet. But these are examples that are from Kingston. So you have these are manor houses. It's hard for me to read the densities from here, but they can get a lot of units within these large. They were probably converted from a large single-family house and then made into apartments.
So to clarify some of the terminology too, I think you guys know what a duplex is, right? 2 single families attached. Townhouses are more than 2 attached in a row. When you transition into, instead of being attached single family, into being small multifamily, that's where some of the terms we use. A manor house is a structure that looks like a large single family home, but it probably has 3 to 6 units inside of it. Obviously, generally smaller units, or else it would look much larger. And then there's a next scale up. I think we called them village apartments here, but there are also a number of buildings that are in the range of 6 to 12 units that, again, are bigger still. We'll show you some examples. Think of a big bed and breakfast or a small inn would be of that scale. But again, without being to the point when you're over 12 units, that's in a single building, that's when you're starting to be the more conventional multifamily. So just wanted to clarify what some of those terms mean.
So then Peaceville is where we found probably the majority of the missing middle housing types that we looked at. And this is probably going back to the fact that it was a mill town, right? So they had more affordable options, more modest housing. So we found a range all the way from ADUs all the way up to some what we're calling village apartments. A lot of duplexes and cottages, not cottage courts per se, like in the zoning language that is being proposed, but clusters, small clusters of cottages. On the next slide. And so again, here's some examples of some of those duplexes and cottages that we found. And we went through and took not only just photo inventory, we pulled the aerials for these to get a sense of how are they sited on the site. And also we looked at the density, how many units are, and then also how per acre that they would have. And then last, we did Wakefield. And this one was contrary to all the others, where the types that we found were actually outside of the core of the village. So that's kind of an interesting thing that might provide some more further research. And here it was a lot of manor houses. There's some more modern townhouses, things like that. You have Chatham Farm Way, which was a lot of different types on one property of a redeveloped old manor house type. Next. So from that, we then took those original housing types that we were looking at, and we sort of defined those in terms of South Kingstown. So what's the character for South Kingstown? What does the density for South Kingstown for each of these types look like? So we have the ADU, which would be 1 to 2 stories, and you can see we have these diagrams on the right that show a little bit more detail of how those might look in sort of the floor plan, right? So you're going to be, if an ADU, you're going to have your garage on the bottom and a flat above. So then a cottage is typically 1 to 2 stories, often 1.5. So you can see that's, again, an individual entry with a porch, and they're usually clustered with we found 2 to 4 dwelling units per acre in South Kingstown.
So again, the existing examples tried to help us set what the metric was that was appropriate here. So both what kind of size of unit we were seeing, right? You want to define how big a cottage can be, right? So we weren't just pulling numbers out of thin air. We said of the 20 cottages that we found in and around South Kingstown, what were the size of those? When we looked at how a duplex sat on a lot, what was the resulting density, right? Density is how many units on how much land. So, you could have a single cottage on 3 acres of land, and it's still going to be, low density. So the housing types have to also be understood in their context and how they sit on a lot. But again, the metrics we used were tied to the examples we were finding in town, because that was the point, right? What's appropriate for this town.
So again, the duplex, which is a single family, I think familiar with those, semi-detached. So those were usually 1.5 to 2 stories, only 2 units per building, with 4 to 11 dwelling units per acre. And the townhouses, we found those to be typically about, I think it was 2 or 3 units attached, and those will often, have their own entries as well, sharing a wall, a party wall, and they're usually 1 to 2 stories, with about 5 to 12 units per acre. And the stacked flats, we found to be about 2 to 3 stories. So those are higher in height than a lot of the other types that we were looking at. And they would be 2 to 3 units per building, about 8 to 15 dwelling units per acre. And go ahead.
I was going to say, that's one we didn't talk about before, but obviously the idea, there's a typical duplex we often think of as a side-by-side duplex. But there are times when you might have 2 units where there's a lower unit and one up above it. We found examples of those when we looked around. That might both be 2 single-story units, or the upper unit could be almost more like a townhouse sitting over a second unit. So when we say stacked flat, that's kind of what we were going after. Again, it's a little bit generic sounding, but you could also think of it as a stacked duplex instead of a side-by-side duplex.
And then for the manor house, I had mentioned that being, again, in the scale of a single-family house. And a lot of the examples in town were probably converted from a single-family house originally. So those are ranging about 1.5 to 3 stories, and 4 to 6 units per building, and 5 to 12 dwelling units per acre. And I'll point out, too, that typically when we define it, we say that might have a central entry with a common shared circulation. But sometimes with the older conversion of houses, you might see a different example. But, again, with the walk-ups, which we did translate that later to be called out a village apartment, sort of these, they're larger in scale, right, but they're still very residential in feel. 2 to 3 stories, about 8 to 12 units per building, and those were ranging from 5 to 25 dwelling units per acre. And that high end likely coming from some of those micro units possibly that we saw at the college, near the college.
So the example in the lower left, that photograph is up in Kingston. I'm really curious what the history of that building was. Was it purpose-built as a 10-unit building, or was it something else once upon a time? Because it's a little bit bigger than a single-family house, or it was a very big single-family house. So we didn't come across the history of how it became to be what it was, but it's a good example of a building that sits right on the street next to others, next to single-family homes, and doesn't necessarily feel out of place because it was well-cited, well-detailed, et cetera.
And we can direct you to people who would know that. The chair of the HDC, I'm sure, is very familiar with that.
Yeah.
So then we moved on to taking those examples that we saw and evaluating them, looking at sort of the dimensions that they have, our knowledge of other projects as well as like what can be built, and started to put those into a set of standards and zoning language that you guys could use to then, get more diversity in your housing.
Just before they move on to these slides, what we talked about with Jeremy and Jeff and Erica is you saw all these sample types of units, and they're all one-offs, and I don't think anyone has any anxiety if someone built a cottage or a duplex. And my challenge to the team was, is there a way that you can demonstrate or show or ease the visual aspect of what density means and how projects look like when you put 4 duplexes on a property or 4 townhouses or 3 mansions, and how that relates to the neighborhood. So I think they did a good job in the next few slides trying to articulate what that type of development looks like when you start to put pieces of these units together in one development.
I also just want to quickly suggest this is not a challenge unique to missing middle types, right? When someone proposes 30 single-family homes, you're probably concerned it's the same house 30 times, that provides, not the variety you would hope for. So, yes, someone could propose 12 duplexes that all look the same, but I think you'd use the same scrutiny you would for any other project, that if they're being too repetitive, you would ask for some variety, you would look for that. We tried to embed a little bit of that here, but again, I just want to make sure it's clear that that's not a uniquely missing middle challenge, right? Any development could propose the same large apartment building 6 times, and you might say, that's getting to be a little bit obnoxious. Can you please consider some more variety here? So,
also often add more regulation to non-single family houses than the alternatives.
Also wondering if in your look through Peacedale, if you noted some of the traditional mill housing that I think they're called Foursquare, and some of them have been made into duplexes, and they're actually very nicely done, and they've been there forever.
Yeah, we definitely came across those, and I'm not even sure we knew that they were originally 4, but now duplexes. But again, if there were 4 units in the building, that we would have categorized that as a manor house, right? Again, it's a structure that's almost single family in scale, happened to have 4 units converted to 2 units. As Erica suggested, some of these things were clearly the other way. It was like a single family home that was probably eventually turned into 4 apartments or whatever the case might be. So,
just a quick question, and you're probably going to address this, but if not, you can think about it. Jeff said earlier that you can't build any of this and then rent it out at $1,100 a month. And so it seems like conversions of a lot of existing housing stock might be the way to go. And so I look at where some of the larger houses are in town. I think here along High Street, it probably would be an easy sell, but I think about the other side, the south side of Main Street, a lot of big, beautiful homes, and I can imagine a lot of resistance from neighbors when someone says, I want to take my great, big, beautiful home here and convert it into 4 apartments. And I hope that's something that we can address as well, this idea of multi-unit housing in single-family residential zones without having the state, as they thought about doing, mandate it for us.
I think that's a great point. I often make the analogy to cars. It's hard to build a new affordable car, right? You kind of need it to be a used car to be a little more affordable. And so it's a great example of that, right? The conversion probably is a little bit more cost effective than from scratch.
And I think that's exactly how we were approaching the regulations, that they're a little indifferent as to whether you're building new or whether you're converting an existing building. If you can fit it on the footprint and meet the dimensional standards and the site standards, whether it's in an existing building or a new building, it should be okay. If you're okay with the concept, it should be okay, new or conversion.
Just worried about the neighbors not being comfortable with the concept.
The neighbors are not going to be thrilled about, I know. That is something that this body is going to have to deal with on a number of levels.
And then, sometimes we hear from developers that conversion is more difficult, more expensive than building new. And have you found any means by which to convince them that it's worthwhile?
I don't think there's an easy answer to it. Every project's a little bit different, right? I'm not saying one's cheap and one's expensive. All new construction, any conversion is a challenge. Again, I think the ultimate proposition here is if you can spread the land cost over more units, that's typically where the savings is. A square foot of wood construction is kind of a square foot of wood construction, right? So it's a little bit, it's the spreading of the cost of the land, and it's also creating opportunities for doing smaller units, right? No one's building a 700 square foot single family home on 2 acres. It just won't pencil out. It doesn't make sense. But if you could combine 4 or 5 of those into a structure on a 1 acre lot, suddenly now maybe the math is starting to work it out a little better, or that's why the sales prices should hopefully be lower.
So when we got to this stage, we sort of narrowed this down a little bit. So we weren't talking about all the different housing types, so that the duplexes really became townhouses, right? We can still say that if you have that 2 units, and that can still be considered under the townhouse regulation. And a manor house, that can also can envelop the stacked flat term that we were using. So we can go to the next slide. So for the first part of it, which I'll go through briefly too in the next set of slides, but we just wanted to talk about things that Jamie was talking about that people are concerned about. How are the entries being handled? What kind of design variety is there? What are the open space standards, and how are these things composed in the units? How are the units composed?
Oh.
Is that? Yeah. There we go. So for the cottage community, because these are handled a little bit different than the other types,
Can I ask a question while we wait? I'm having a hard time understanding why putting two houses together and calling it a duplex costs about half as much money as building two separate houses.
Yeah, it's definitely not half as much money. The cost of the construction, 1,000 square feet, whether it's detached or attached, there's a nominal difference.
Be the same.
It's very similar. So that's where I was suggesting that I think the big difference becomes a matter of the land cost. So if I can put 2 units on the same amount of land as I would otherwise only be allowed to put 1 house on, the land cost gets to be half as much.
That's what's reflected in this chart.
Yeah.
Okay, that was my question.
And also wondering if you will have any images or thoughts with regard to commercial buildings that are single-story and then adding on a second or third floor with units contained, because that seems like a very good way to add infill within our villages.
Yeah, so that was outside of the scope of what this initial exercise was. We certainly saw plenty of examples, like in Wakefield. We said, we didn't find many, but if you look on the main street, there are a lot of great examples of commercial downstairs, apartments up above. So that's definitely a viable strategy for providing some of it as well.
Our main charge was for the residential districts. But we've always known that the mixed-use component and what's happening on Main Street, what's happening further out towards Route 1, it's a different project for a different day, but yes.
Yeah, we feel that we have an amazing opportunity in that old Tower Hill
Absolutely.
Road corridor, because
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
I couldn't agree more. Any other questions while we wait?
So I understood from your original presentations that theoretically, putting a lot of units on one piece of land, small units, small house lots, would make the houses theoretically less expensive. South Kingstown has been discovered, and our housing prices have shot through the roof. So hypothetically, if we had a project where the whole piece of property was clear-cut, a whole lot of very small houses were built very close together on that clear-cut land, and then the houses were put on the market for $600,000 apiece, where have we fallen short, and what can we do to remedy permitting very dense development on tiny little house lots, little houses, and yet the price is not reflective of that concession, the concession that we made, hoping for workforce ability, affordable houses. And maybe it's a South Kingstown thing, but this wasn't what we had in mind. And what could we have done, or how do we prevent this kind of, or is that just the way it is?
I think that's the way it is if you're expecting the private market to take care of affordability, like right now. And this is not a South Kingstown thing. This is happening in communities all over the coastal area that we've been working with recently. One example, we're working on the Cape right now in a little town that the town has some town-owned property that they want to build housing on, and they don't want it to be traditional subsidized, like what would count as LMI housing. They want it to be available for people making between 80 and 150% of the area median income, because there's a huge gap. and we're really encouraging them to actually write that into the RFP for development. It has to be part of your standards. And even though, the town, if you went that route, that housing wouldn't count towards your 10% for LMI, there are communities that are doing it just because they need it, because there's a great need in the community. The other thing to consider, of course, is that there are other reasons for encouraging denser housing than affordability alone. This issue of housing diversity and the different needs for people at different stages of life. Yeah, if you build tiny little houses, there's going to be a premium because people want to downsize and they want to continue living in the community. The nice thing is, from the big picture standpoint, if that means that someone who has a 4-bedroom house with 2 baths and they are done raising their family, they have a way to move into this smaller house and free up the single-family home for a new family, as opposed to just being stuck there because they don't know where else to go or they don't really have any other options. So it is all of these things. It's a yes-and sort of situation where the affordability isn't the only consideration. But yes, in this heated market, I think that's why your inclusionary zoning is so critical, because without it, you can't. In many cases, you can't build dense enough to hit your affordability targets.
But even tonight, I'm sorry that you said that by lowering the price of your land, you should in turn lower the selling price of your market rate units. Because if you're fitting more houses on a piece of land, that'll reduce the cost for a purchaser of the house. Mm-hmm. But we've seen an example where that is not the case. And so I live in a 4-bedroom house right now with my husband, and we're talking about retirement. We're kind of thinking about that. Why will I sell this house and buy a 2-bedroom house for $600,000? Like, that's not a good trade for me unless the house I'm living in is worth a whole lot more than $600,000. Like, that's not providing housing for transition because it's so expensive. Who's going to transition, downsize into a $600,000 house? So I guess I'm just not understanding.
Lots of people. The market is there for that. It is insane, but the market is there for that, and there are a lot of people who want that and will even pay a premium for it being smaller because they don't want to deal with the maintenance issues of a larger property. So and I think, Jeremy, you're about to say something.
No, I was going to say, there is no magic bullet for affordability, right? If there was, every town would be doing it. I think it's trying to chip away at the larger issues that we have. It's a step in the right direction. It is, again, 80% of your housing stock is single-family homes. I doubt 80% of the families living in South Kingstown are mom and dad with 2.5 kids, right? So what we've often found is we've been building the same way for 50 years, but it's not addressing every segment of the population. There's not good options for empty nesters. They're not good options for young professionals who are single or, young couples or single parents, right? If everything's a 4-bedroom house, it only addresses a very slim percentage of the families that are out there. And so you're finding a lot of folks that are still in homes that made sense once upon a time, but there just aren't options for places to go. So again, I don't want us to Jeff's point, overly emphasize the affordability issue. It's more than that. There's a number of other issues I think that are on the table. And it is a supply and demand issue. If there's only 4 cottages available and there's 4,000 people looking for those 4 cottages, the prices go up, right? But that doesn't mean you don't start trying to work your way to this problem and try to address it. And I think part of this too is keep in mind what we're trying to suggest is let's try to focus development into the areas that are already developed, already have infrastructure, so that we can preserve some of the outer areas that don't just keep getting eaten up. And the best way to make the most out of that existing infrastructure is to make sure you're putting more units rather than less units. Otherwise, you've wasted an opportunity if you've only infilled with 10 units where you could have infilled with 30 units, for instance. Is there a missed opportunity that helps try to address some of those other pressures?
Susan, just to expand upon that, in your example, and we used a 20-lot development at $599 a piece or $600,000. That takes in the infrastructure costs, the land acquisition costs, and that's spread over 20 units, which results in a $600,000 sale price. If that same developer potentially only built 10 houses, He still has to spread the land costs over those 10 units. So in all likelihood, he wouldn't build a 1,200 square foot home. He'd build a 3,200 square foot home. It wouldn't be on the market for $599. It'd be on the market for $999 or 1.1. So to Jeremy's point, I don't see a magic bullet or a creation to that. The offers, if the density is not offered, to spread the cost to try and control some market conditions. The alternative is big houses on bigger lots for more money. And in your example, you wouldn't even have the option of selling your house at a break-even point to new construction on a smaller lot. You would be in your house, and to replace your house, you'd probably have to pay your house off and take on another $400,000 mortgage to get the same thing you have. And, but it's really hard during this discussion to try and anticipate and control and almost try and manipulate market conditions. You're only trying to set a format where there may be an opportunity for a developer to bring, we'll use the term, a more affordable option to the table than the traditional 1 acre, 3,000 square foot home on a cul-de-sac. And again, we have our experts here to weigh in on that.
Point, and I drive by that development almost every day, the one you're talking about, and I do think that there was an opportunity lost, or we maybe didn't do as good of a job for the town as possible. And I think that one of the reasons we're pushing for affordability, right? I mean, the developer's going to sell for whatever he can get, but we were hoping for affordable housing. And the tool we used, or the developer used, was just put a lot of single families closer together. And I think at some point, if you're trying to reach a certain density, we got to be looking for other things other than single families. And I realized there was a couple duplexes in there. But the other thing on that is that the density extended not only to that land that was in the back, but it extended to the road in the front. And now, instead of that being a community, now it's become this really dense as you drive by down the street, because they're stacked on the main road as well as in the back. So I think we got to realize that once we get past a certain density, we got to be encouraging other than single family houses. And, a little mixture of duplexes. We got to encourage that. And then the other thing is that when we do have single family houses, or even multifamily, and that type of density, we really got to try to focus on that community feel and maybe keep it a little isolated from front road. So I do think that we missed an opportunity on that, and I know when I drive by, I'm not crazy about it.
And the challenge with that, of course, was that it was a comprehensive permit, so we have a lesser degree of ability to really tweak that site plan and have that neighborhood feel.
So Maria, I know Jeremy and Erica have a few examples of maybe, if you have a vacant site, how possibly to develop it in a different manner. And to Joe's point, you can develop the regs, you can develop the things. We have talent at the table tonight. The developers that always come forward have different variations of talent as it relates to their team, and again, they're using different permitting processes, whether it's our regulatory one or the comprehensive permit. So there's a balance, but I agree with Joe that if you can encourage and steer to a particular development type and scenario, you may have a leg up on everyone.
Keep going. Good. All right. So for the cottage community, it's a little bit different than the others. There's a lot more concern on the open space, right? So part of the design standards, we're talking about that and making sure that the open space is pleasing and that the cottages face around the open space in order to give that cottage court community feel. That also gives a lot of eyes to the open space, right? So it doesn't feel isolated and unwelcoming. So things like adding in common buildings as well. Gardens, having those transition zones between that common space and the unit itself, and adding a front porch as well is really helpful. Again, it kind of sets that boundary between what's like private, public, semi-private zones. For the townhouses, we talked a lot about a configuration. So you might have something that looks like 4 individual units, or it might look like one big building, but then you have these individual entries you know, a little bit of variety in the roof line, things to help it look a lot more design friendly between each unit. The manor house, again, so we talk about having a central entry, possibly a secondary entry, but that should be not the main focus. Making it still look like it's a residential feel, like it looks like a large family house, even though it's a new development. And the same thing for the village apartment. So you still want to make sure that even though this is a multifamily building, obviously this is a really great example that's local in town, that's going to be hard to replicate, but something like that still has a residential scale and feel. A lot of times we'll put this a half story, right, so that the scale of the building doesn't feel as big. So when we looked at the dimensional requirements, and this is a lot of text, I won't go over it, but just to highlight key differences, you can just see how we're going up in scale just slightly through each of them. We tried to control for things like building height, which I know is a big concern. The unit area, so we looked at the examples in town to provide maximums for the units. Try to give some flexibility, but also encourage that there might be a range of unit sizes within something like the managed house or the village apartment. Hopefully it's not all just micro units. Maybe there's a range to provide, that, again, that diversity of housing. For the frontage, we looked at the examples in town for this, and also just kind of, especially with the village apartment projects that we've done, to give a good idea of that range of scale that you could have. And controlling, again, for things like your dormer roof pitches, your dormer length, and also what we put in here is the roof span, which we have diagrams if you want to move on to that. So instead of, a lot of times there's concern over having this big, massive roof, kind of an unappealing structure. So we wanted to try to control for that a little bit. So we come up with this maximum roof span as well, which you can see in the 3D diagrams, which again, and we put those diagrams to show people as well in the how these units might stack and how the units might be arranged within the different unit types. And I think, some people mentioned being concerned about the public way. If you go back one, Jeremy. Yeah. So we do have this in the regulations that, the units should front on a public way or some type of frontage, whether or not it's the street or a park or something like that. And I think that is important. But again, it's hopefully that all of these design standards have controlled so that you don't have something that you don't like. And hopefully it's within the scale of the neighborhood around it as well. And then this is an example of the cottage communities. It's a little bit different than the other ones, just showing again how the spacing between the units, the common space that they front, and how much space that each unit has as well. So for our last part, we'll talk about some case studies that have been done, just to show examples of infill and redevelopment of properties. And first, did you want to go ahead?
So this is a slide we've used a lot. Density can take many forms. One of the things we ultimately try to point out is density is just a mathematical equation. But what's really important is what the form is. That's what you don't look at a building and go, that's 12 units to the acre. You look at a building and say, that's too big, that's too small, that fits in, right? So the two examples we show up here, this was an actual project of ours on the right. This is the Cottages on Green in the town I live in, East Greenwich, Rhode Island. On the left is what the zoning requirements called for. You could go to 20 units to an acre, had big setbacks. You could, as a result, it was a 3/4 of an acre lot, so there was one unit in an existing house in the front and then a 14-unit multifamily building, and everybody in the community hated it. There was like, there's no way this would go forward. So what we proposed was what's shown on the right. That's still the same 15 units, the one existing house, plus 14 cottages, some of which are detached, some of which are attached. And now we had something that was much more sympathetic to the surrounding context, which was predominantly single family. From the road, it looked like just a few more infill single family homes. But the homes fronted on this cottage court, they consolidated the parking. So our point is that both of these were 20 units to the acre, but the overall impact of that was quite different. So I think that's what we're trying to get across with some of these regulations and dimensional requirements, is how do you deliver the density, but in forms that are appropriate, in something that looks appropriate, not something that looks inappropriate. And that's what I think you guys are trying to get away from. So
yeah, and this is just some examples of infill lots. I think you mentioned that as well being an issue. So these were, underutilized or vacant lots. In the case of the lot on the north, that's a parking lot. currently in front of an existing building. And so, how can we sort of like hack away at these places that can be utilized for, more housing options? The next slide. And then the next few are just a variety of examples that you guys looked at for the Cape Cod Community Resiliency. So again, this is in Falmouth, is a big shopping center with a lot of parking. So coming up with an idea that shows a lot of mix of housing types. You have those walk-up or village apartments all the way down to duplex and I think some cottages in there that transitions to that single family between the two large-scale developments. Next. And I think that was at 20 DU per acre too as well. So this is an example of 14 DUs per acre. Again, we don't have the before, but it's a typical strip mall plaza with parking in the front and really underutilized site. So now again, looking at putting a mix of housing. And I will say a couple of these examples here, this one in particular too, we've been asked, by the town to come back and look at different options for. Some of them are going to lean more commercial, less housing based, but actually in this case, it's going to be higher density because the town is really looking for more housing options. But again, here, this was previously a hotel, and so trying to show and demonstrate, different types of housing that can be put on that lot that transition to the neighborhoods behind, but also, keeping with the character of the street.
So the point here was just that you could assemble these types. I know one scenario is there's a 1 acre lot available, and so you're putting one of these on that lot as an infill project, which is great. But there is also a scenario where someone that has a slightly larger lot that could handle more buildings, you can use multiple types together, and you can create 10 to 20 units to an acre, but the resulting project still is sort of a village character or village feel. And that's, I think, ultimately what we're trying to achieve here as well. So again, it's not limited to one building, one lot. There's also the potential to combine these things on larger lots to create, new neighborhoods, if you will. So.
And one thing I want to reiterate from Erica's presentation is that our goal for these housing types, again, is to analyze the existing missing middle housing that you have in the community. And again, the analysis that they do is tremendous. Like, what are the dimensions today that work in the community, and building regulations around those dimensions. So this issue we're talking about, like what's fronting the street, looks inappropriate and crunched. We're going to have regulations. Let's say any given building must reach these dimensions and have this certain amount of architectural variety so that it reads as a large single-family home, whether it's fronting the street or if it's a deeper lot with multiple buildings forming a community. We also, much like what we've done with the cottage community, intend to build in that variety if there is a proposal for multiple buildings that you may not have the same design over and over and over again, that there has to be a certain level of variety from house to house or building to building, and basically a menu of architectural variety that you can pick from, and you have to have at least so much variety from building to building. So there are a number of things that we can do to ensure that the basic form is compatible with the housing that exists in the community today. And so hopefully, whether that is in fact a 12-bedroom mansion with, one old lady and a cat, or 12 apartments with many different type of people living there, as long as the form is correct and you have the parking on site to accommodate it, you're good. The next big question then is where that's allowed, and which zoning districts you're comfortable having that kind of development. That's our big thing is, we want consistency from zoning district to zoning district. So thinking about where that's appropriate, or if you need an overlay zone of some kind. But that would be our next charge. If you're comfortable with this general concept, then we would do our best to go to the drawing board and come back to you with regulations that develop these forms regardless of density. Again, so long as the site can also support the density in terms of parking and water and so forth.
Thanks, Jeff. I think one of the questions that I have is when you look at some of the photos that you showed of the sort of Victorian-style historic manor houses that have been converted, to what extent can you give the varied architectural variety that will lend itself so that realistically we know those buildings are unlikely to be duplicated, but it does look like there are some elements in some of your designs, not just the front porch, but I think maybe the roof pitch also. There are things that make them look a little different from your typical dorm kind of look of a building. And so that's my first question. How do you find that balance? And then how do you, again, based on what kind of acreage you have, allow for creation of those neighborhoods that we've talked about?
Yeah, I mean, I think on the first point, I would say it's kind of interesting. When you actually walk around a historic village, not every house is the Taj Mahal. A lot of them actually are pretty simple structures with pretty straightforward forms, simple detailing. They get painted a couple different colors. Sometimes the gable goes front, sometimes the gable goes sideways. You know, there's often a subtler range of variety in some of the historic structures than we often imagine there to be. I mean, the Victorian stuff obviously is an extreme, you know, where there's every one of them was trying to show off in a way, but there's a humility to, I think, a lot of the historic architecture that you find. So I think some of this is also not trying too hard, right? Not getting to a point where you're trying to put a fancy turret on every corner, nor will the developer be able to afford it. So how do you keep the form simple, but how do you still get some variety of how to maybe, like what we would do, we would say sometimes the gable goes one way, sometimes it's the other, between 2 or 3 different porch details, some full, some half. You know, between the way we deal with the windows, are they individual, or maybe there's some groupings, colors. You know, there's a couple of little things that if you just do that between 6 buildings, every one of them will look unique. And you haven't gone to the trouble of just making, you know, one craftsman, one Victorian, one modern, one, you know. So I think you can get a lot of mileage out of some of the simpler approaches. And again, the examples are all around us if we go for a walk. So I think that's kind of a critical point, you know, to think about. It could be kind of simple. It doesn't have to be a difficult effort. And then the second part of your question was about combining them into a larger community.
Right, and how do you retain that sense of creating neighborhoods or, you know, within the villages?
Yes, so I think that has probably as much to do with site design as it does architecture, right? The way that we configure the buildings, how we handle the parking. Do we create shared spaces? Do we have shared walkways? Do we have common greens, right? Those are all things that, again, if your single-family home regulations are good, they should require a lot of these same things, right, in terms of how do these come together and make wonderful places, right? And so, you know, again, there's no easy answer to that other than just being mindful of those things and or, again, I think a lot of what we were commenting on was just replicate the patterns of what you're already finding in the village. Like, it kind of bothers me that the assumption is with new development that we're going to push it way back and screen it. Why not have it be on the street like all of its neighbors and contribute and hold them to the same standard as the neighbors versus fighting about how much screening you can put in place in front of them, you know? So it's, but again, I get where that comes from. So, yeah, I think it's just, you have to still you still have to have a nice site plan, again, regardless of whether or not it's a single family house or a couple of village apartments or a mixture of everything in between.
I think you'll see, like, what we did for the cottage court is very similar to what we had proposed at a different scale for these other types, if there are going to be multiple of them on the same lot. You know, we had the standards for the common green, for the walkways, for the circulation, and certainly we would do the same for these and have standards for your frontage area and how it interacts with you know, the sidewalk and all that great urban design with how the building interacts with the public realm. So I would encourage you to go back and see what you liked or didn't like about the cottage regulations, because it's a lot of those same things that we use in zoning to regulate the site design for a neighborhood feel.
You know, when you talk about the neighborhood feel, I mean, I think about South County Commons. You know, you've got some senior housing there and some market rate apartments and restaurants and a fake downtown street, and none of it works. You know, it looks like one big commercial development, and, you know, and not ending up with that. The other thing that I think of is, and I like the idea of the simple forms and not going overboard with design details, because it seems like in a lot of things that we've looked at, you know, you have sort of this faux colonial reproduction. You know, it's got some elements of what you might see in a 100-year-old house, but it doesn't look like a 100-year-old house. It looks like a 2022 house with some things sort of glued onto it. And I definitely don't want to go there. You know, I think having that variety of the forms, keeping it simple. You know, another building I think of is the Westerly Credit Union building, which sort of, when you look at it, it's kind of like an icon for, it looks like a building you might find in Westerly, except it's got giant picture windows on the second floor, and it just sort of doesn't work. And I don't know that we can get into that level of oversight on architecture, but I don't know how we avoid that. I don't know how we avoid another South County Commons if there were a lot that big and someone said, I want to do, you know, 100 units of a mixed cottage and end up with something that looks like a neighborhood and not a commercial development pretending to be a neighborhood.
Yeah, so I think a couple of lessons from South County Commons. One, there's not a whole lot of, I think the whole thing's painted yellow, if I remember correctly, right? Like it's not like there's a lot of effort given to that per se. I mean, I think they were trying to still stick with there's a cohesiveness here. Maybe it's too much. The footprints of every one of those buildings is much larger than anything we would allow for. The depth of those buildings, that was part of that roof forms. Like, that's a great example. Those buildings are probably loaded corridors upstairs. They're probably 65 feet deep. So their roofs go way up and way down again. And one of the things we observed is, even with some of these larger structures, the span for the roof was never any more than, say, 30 to 40 feet. So the roof feels more residential in the scale, right? So I think South County Commons, again, I think it's better than most conventional development would be, right? It doesn't quite get to the point of feeling like downtown Wakefield. But I will also say downtown Wakefield feels the way it does because it was handcrafted over 300 years. It wasn't built in 3 months. So it's very difficult to kind of replicate something like a downtown Wakefield in new development. You have to work very hard. We have one project going right now that I think comes close, and it's because every corner is a uniquely detailed thing, right? We're being, you know, the budget for it is much higher than a conventional development tries to go after. So it's not to say it's impossible, but to imagine that every project can achieve a downtown Wakefield level of variety and feel and texture and every roof height, right? There's a reason Wakefield, thankfully, it's special, and it should always be special. You know, I would almost hate if South County Commons looked just like Wakefield, right? So,
does the project you are referencing integrate commercial with residential? Because that's part of the issue.
It does. It does. That project has their mixed-use structure, so it's commercial on the ground floor, it's apartments up above. Yeah.
And I do want to reiterate that our charge for this particular project, again, was focused on strictly your residential zones, and we're really not expecting that this would apply to any area where something even remotely like South County Commons could occur. That really is a different set of regulatory features if you're going to manage development at that scale and that mixed-use scale. And I agree that's something that's needed, and I agree with Maria that there's a huge opportunity to meet a lot of your housing demand through that type of development in those locations. But just to reiterate, what we're proposing would not apply to that sort of situation.
Maria, I have this slide up because these are some of the subject matters in working with Jeff and Jeremy about some of the concerns and some of the discussion items that went up, and just, you know, I termed it as concerns and fears with the missing middle, and there are, you pointed out some uncertainty. You write a regulation, you see these wonderful, beautiful pictures of how it should be done, how it can be done, and then your fear is, will the developer do it, or how will the developer use the regulation to do it in a different manner with unintended consequences? You know, how do you deal with the density, which I think Jeremy and Jeff kind of talked about, on the lot? How does that lot relate to the established neighborhood? You know, your fear of architecture is rinse and repeat, where it's that one unit repeated multiple times on a project. And I think from a regulatory standpoint, you can correct that and potentially prevent it. You know, is there a decent unit mix? What is finding the balance? And then, you know, we touched upon it a little bit tonight of what is the interrelationship between the new development and the existing development. And some examples that Jeremy showed, you have an existing strip center. If that's a tear down and you're coming in with a cottage development, that's probably an easily welcome change. But if you are proposing a cottage development on a vacant lot with a density of 12 units an acre next to an established neighborhood that has 1 unit or only 2 units an acre, it becomes a different dynamic and story. And to Paul's point, I think a lot of times, and the town doesn't have it yet, and I know it's potentially something that could be coming in the future, it needs a lot more discussion, is developing architectural design guidelines. And a lot of it is, and Jeremy and Don Powers and I have talked about this a lot, sometimes you don't need to create a whole bunch of regulations. You just need a whole bunch of pictures of what you like and what you don't like. And it's easier to tell a developer that this isn't what we want you to build. This is the example that was built before, and it would meet the regulatory requirements of our words, but that's not the intended architecture, density, or style of development we want. So the picture of what we don't like, coupled with the regulations, coupled with some pictures of what you do like, gives a developer some direction. So again, I just put this up as talking points for the discussion. And I love the interchange this evening.
What I think is interesting is your slides on affordability. I think with 2020, it's completely changed in the last 2 years, and it has gotten a whole lot worse.
Yep.
I mean, and that's probably especially true for the rental market. We don't see projects come in front of us for rentals. I mean, we'll see maybe a couple, and it'll be a comprehensive permit because the developer's trying to push it onto a homeowner, the whole responsibility versus, them taking on the affordable stuff. Or in this community, we see maybe some associated with URI where they can rent out the rooms at a much higher rate. But just for rentals for the community, we don't see them. And that's probably everywhere, right? And that's really just making the problem so much worse because the demand's growing and the supply's not. And things are just getting worse. So I think, and I do, so trying to figure out how do we fit new rentals into the existing community and make them fit, I think is one of the biggest challenges that we have. And I do agree when you're talking about price per square foot. I think that part of the solution is making smaller places, right? And stop thinking about density as the number of units per acre, but the number of bedrooms per unit acre, right?
Yeah.
Because when we look at the impacts to the community, it really gets down to how many people live next door to me, how many cars do they have, right? How big is the house, the overall structure, So I do think part of that solution is making smaller units, more efficient units, but we also got to integrate those residential rentals into that residential, and that's a big challenge for us. Mm-hmm. But it's becoming a crisis in Rhode Island. It's just, I own rentals. I used to get calls when I had advertisements, and maybe once or twice a week when I didn't have advertisements. I get 2 or 3 a day, and I don't have anything available, and haven't had anything available. It's just,
Yeah.
And I got to say, I think the state is failing us. They're putting money towards things like incentive to landlords if you take on Section 8. That doesn't solve the problem. You still only have the same number of units. You still have the same number of people that are homeless. It's just that you're shifting it from people that can afford to pay to people that are getting subsidies. It's so misdirected. But anyways, there's big challenges, to say the least.
No, and again, I think a lot of this is, we've just been doing the same thing for 50, 60, it's probably more like 70 years at this point in time, right? Missing middle, we call it that because there was a time all this stuff just coexisted and happened and you had all these options and these variations. Then we try to get really simple with our zoning codes, and we oversimplified the problem to the point that we've created this issue because all we've built is primarily single-family homes, not just South Kingstown. Globally, most towns have very similar zoning regulations, right? And when they oversimplified what they thought was the problem, they created the problem by not allowing for this mix of stuff that we used to have. So,
Well, I think that I probably speak for many people in South Kingstown that we're here because it's not densely populated. And I don't think most people are looking to bring a lot more cars onto the road, a lot more people in the stores. That's not what we want. We're trying to achieve our 10%. We're trying to, maybe like you suggested, maybe when I get too old to take care of my house, I might still want to live in Wakefield. Okay, but then we need to design things that little old ladies could manage, and it's not a bunch of stairs and a bunch of people and parking in tight spots. And or if we're trying to get that 10% in, then it can't be that $600,000 house. So if we're going to talk about limiting design, I don't think we want to look at our zoning and go, just bring them on in. We don't have a lot of room left, and we've got to bring in the right things.
But I'd like to follow on. Are you done? Go ahead. Okay. So one of the problems that we're having in South Kingstown is that URI has increased their enrollment by a lot. They're not increasing their housing on campus by a lot. Then Narragansett is sort of chasing the problem now and trying to rein in some of the amount of student housing in Narragansett. But the problem's gotten away from them, and they're having a battle because now they're taking away rights from people that they've already enjoyed. People buy big houses, they rent to 10 kids, they're making money hand over fist, and now the town's trying to rein that in. Additionally, we have, it's beautiful here. We know it's beautiful here. So we can talk about building more units, but it's very lucrative to rent out your apartments or your houses or whatever we're building to students at $1,000 per bedroom per month. And then for 3 months of the year, $5,000 a week for a beach rental or Airbnb at $500 a night. So I believe we're losing a huge amount of our housing stock in town to investment, especially investment from out of state. And we're not in that big pickle yet, but it's coming. And especially with Narragansett trying to pull in their student housing, South Kingstown's even a better option for student housing because we're closer to URI than Narragansett is. But the Airbnb, the short-term rental, and then summer rental here is a serious problem and getting worse. COVID made it a lot worse. People are now, I know so many people, and maybe it's my age group, who own a house someplace else in the state and then come down here for the weekends. So this house is sitting vacant for the whole winter, or it's got students in it for the winter. But it's people who own multiple houses. So I don't know that you guys are great, but building more units isn't necessarily, and this follows on what Joe said, isn't necessarily going to house people that we need to house. We're going to house students, and we're going to house New Yorkers, and people from doing investments, and people coming for the weekends to come enjoy the Matunic Oyster Bar. How do we build housing that will actually house people who are here year-round and are here contributing to our economy? Our school population has plummeted in this town. We're closing schools now because nobody can afford to live here. Nobody who can afford to live here is having kids because it's just gotten so expensive. And with out-of-state investment, there's really no limit on what you're willing to pay for a house if your annual income from a property is $30,000 a year. Like, there's no limit to what you're willing to pay, so now our prices are up through the roof. So what can we do as a town to rein it in before it becomes a serious problem? And now, like Newport with their Airbnb legislation they're trying to pass, we're on the cusp of being in a real serious crisis. And we need to do something now to prevent taking away rights from people after they've enjoyed their Airbnb or they've enjoyed their student rentals, and we're trying to claw back these properties. I think we need to do some ordinances now to limit something in this town so that we don't become like Newport, like Narragansett. And we don't want to be dense like Warwick, and it's just all rentals. Like, that's not helping us to build denser if it's not families and real people living in the units. So that's what I have to say.
And that is a huge problem all over. I'm going to have this exact same conversation tomorrow night in another community. And of course, what you're bringing up is way beyond zoning. there are other things the town can do. It's not something that zoning can solve. And of course, a lot of these market forces are bigger than what the municipality can do, period. But certainly taking a hard look at short-term rentals, taking a harder look at town-owned property and how you can use that. Again, the beauty of town-owned property is you can set the rules. If you're going to build housing, you can say it must be rental. You can say it must be leased out for at least 12 months a year. And there are communities that they're taking more dramatic and drastic steps to do that. Zoning is not the tool for that, unfortunately. So again, what I said earlier, and I think we've all tried to reiterate this, there are no silver bullets. Everything is a yes and. You do what you can with zoning to make a difference, but you acknowledge all the things that you were just saying and these very serious market forces that are wreaking havoc in communities all over the country. So I don't have a simple answer for that other than to say what we're talking about will help in certain ways. It cannot solve the problem by itself, and you're absolutely right. The town needs to be exploring other ways to address this, and some of that's going to be advocating for changes at the state level because the municipalities can't do it alone.
Thank you. So we actually approved an apartment complex that went in last year, and they haven't even finished planting all of the landscape shrubbery out front, and there's a ginormous student rental sign right on the curb. Like, they haven't even finished putting in the landscaping yet, and they haven't put the light bulbs into the outside porches, and there's a big fat student rental sign. And so I think we're thinking that this would be great rentals for year-round people, workforce housing, not too expensive. Boom, it's student rentals. So yeah, that's our problem.
I think, too, when we talk about this, we've got to think about the selling points. We're talking about zoning changes and density changes and the positives. You know, if I present this to my neighbors as, well, this solves a problem for people who can't afford to live here. Well, I can afford to live here. Mm-hmm. So where's the problem? I lost my train of thought. Or even the 10%. I mean, I don't think of any of this as this is a way to get to the 10% and satisfy the state. This is a way to have a diverse community that the people that work here can live here. You know, that the guy that bags my groceries doesn't have to take the bus down from Warwick every day. Or, you know, the guy that fixes my car, that everybody that works in town can live in town if they want to. It's not about reaching the 10%, about reaching some arbitrary standard. It's about having a community that is diverse, that has lots of varied interests, that has lots of interesting people. You know, we are an interesting community because of the university, I think, has gone, because I think South Kingstown would still be a little, you know, farm town, a farm and fishing community. But I just think thinking about what are the positives, and when we go to our neighbors or people that come to meetings to say, I am opposed to this, well, this is why it's good for you, not just good for your neighbor who can't afford to stay here. You know, it's good for everybody.
Yeah, I think you put it really well. This is about meeting the needs of your community and not some arbitrary 10%. I mean, honestly, you hit 10%, you still haven't met the needs of the community. So, yeah, I think that's a really important way to put it.
And I'll reiterate the point about, you know, a large single-family home addresses one particular lifestyle, and there's a multitude of lifestyles that, you know, a lot of the folks we had a very similar set of conversations out on the Cape. A lot of the same issues of seasonal housing and all these things that totally throw things out of kilter. But there were a lot of people that came out and recognized, like, yeah, you're right, I want to stay in my community, but there's nothing that I can afford or move into.
It's going to be a really boring town if the only people that can live here are over 50.
Yeah, well, and the people over 50 are starting to have adult children. They want to move back to the community they grew up in. They can't afford anywhere to, right? They're a single person or a young couple. They can't afford a $1.2 million, 4,000 square foot home, right? So you're right. You need to help people understand that it's in everyone's best interest. It's not that's why I'm trying to downplay the affordability piece of it. That is a piece of it. And even that, as we've admitted, is a small chink in that, you know, challenge, if you will. So it's all these other things too. There's a number of reasons why it's definitely worth considering. So.
And you have to take good advantage of your counsel here, and because a lot of this is how property rights work in the United States. Like, just fundamentally, this is how our country works. This is how property rights work, and I don't know what we do about that. It's again, it's something that we're dealing with all over, and so maybe the lawyers are going to have to come up with some fun and exciting ways for us to work on this within the existing legal context.
Any other thoughts or comments from board members? There are a few of you in the audience tonight. We usually wrap it up by 9 o'clock, but if any of you would like to make some brief comments since you've come out this evening and sat through our meeting.
Wait, can I make a-
Sure, go ahead.
So the members that are in the audience are from the Affordable Housing.
Hey, Joe?
And I hope that maybe they can come up and introduce themselves so that we know who they are. And also, just in general, I'm glad that they came. I think we as a board, a planning board, need to, for each project that has an affordability component, I think we have to be more diligent about getting the advice and counsel from the affordability board, and I also hope that the affordability board coming tonight understands what our concerns are. But maybe if, since there's been new members since the last time we met, if they could maybe introduce themselves.
Not that he's putting you on the spot, but you're certainly welcome
I'm putting you on the
to come
spot.
up and say a few words. Yeah, just come up and speak into the mic, otherwise we
And
won't.
thank you for coming, everybody.
Yes.
Hi, everyone. My name is Alicia Johnson. I actually live in one of the manor houses that you showed on the screen tonight, so shout out to that. I live on South Road. I work for South County Habitat for Humanity, which is an affordable housing developer, and I've learned a lot of great information. So thank you for your time in this report. It's been very insightful.
And what motivated you to want to become part of hopefully the solution?
Yeah, my experience in my job, I work with families every single day who, are in need of safe, decent, and affordable housing, who grew up here, who are using living rooms to house their children to sleep at night, trying to make large families fit in small spaces where that's the only option that was available to them that they could afford. So I do have that as far as myself. Being a young professional, I went to URI. I love this community so very much, and for me to find the apartment I did at the price I did is pretty much a miracle, especially in the market today. So previous to that, I was trying to find somewhere affordable for myself, and this is a community that I see myself settling in, having a family in, but that's kind of on the back burner because the options are very limited. So I wanted to not only be able to have a positive impact for the work I'm doing in the community, but also with myself in mind and hoping that I can call this place home for the long term. So, but I do see the issues that came up tonight with the rental and how the structures are now are fortunately not new, but I'm optimistic that we can come to a variety of solutions, I guess, to try and address the issue. So thank you.
Thank you. And you may be aware of the fact that Habitat did an excellent project on Old North Road a number of years ago, all affordable, and there was a design competition involved, so the architecture fit in nicely but was also unique.
Yeah, that was great. We were able to house a veteran and his family there, two employees at URI, and I can't recall the fourth homeowner, what their occupation is, but we are building a single family home on 138 right now. If you head up towards where the farmer's daughter is, right before Brandywine Court. So that's an example of some of the work we're doing in our community, which sort of mirrors some of the styles that were brought up in this presentation this evening. So,
thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Christian Blaney. I got involved in the affordability issue because I was born and raised here. My wife and I were lucky enough to have purchased in 1998 our first house. Old North Road, I think it was $119,000. And we've, survived, the ups and downs of the housing market. We've got two daughters now, one is going to head to college next year. So we're starting to see, the generational overturn. I've got a lot of family in town, and I've seen them struggle to have, jobs in the local hospitals and be able to afford rent or to afford homes. Seen it with my own parents. So a lot of what you guys have said here is tremendous. The word crisis came up a few times, and I'm a big believer in what we're seeing right now is we're kind of at a crossroad in the town, and I think affordability is a large portion of it. And I think we saw it when the town voted down the high school bond. What we're looking at is the demographics are changing, and people's priorities are changing. And to me, someone who has people in the school, I look at the fact that the high school could have been something that attracted people to the town, but we're not doing it. So does that further repel more people from coming? And it's not whether you believed in the high school or not. The point is we're seeing a demographic shift. Like you said, it's going to be a boring town if everybody's 50 or older, right? And having just hit 50 ourselves, my wife and I, we're starting to see that. So we're going out to dinner at like 4:30 now, and so that sort of stuff. So. But there was so much great information spoken here, and it really is so difficult. I do mortgages for a living, so we're looking at this market is, as Joe said. I mean, the numbers from 2020 I was laughing at because it's 10 times worse than it is now. But with that said, it's also hard to view this now in a housing bubble. This is probably the third or fourth bubble I've been through in my career, and they do move. The difference in South County is that the house that we bought for $119,000 never got back to $119,000, right? It continues to increase a little bit larger due to the demand of the area, because it's a nice town, because of the college rental and all that sort of stuff. So what I really enjoyed listening to you guys talk about was the fact that it definitely isn't an answer just to increase units, but that is part of a long-term plan. And some of these developments you guys were talking about, like the one I know that you're driving by that you won't mention, but I drive by that one too because my daughter's at Curtis Corner. It may look a little weird right now. I really think it's going to be a good community, and it's hopefully not always going to be so expensive just because of the market that we're in. These types of developments are going to ride with the market as things go on. And certainly the design elements and things are going to be a little bit different because they're going to be newer. Like you said very eloquently, downtown Wakefield is downtown Wakefield because of when it was created. I don't mind South County Commons that bad. I think they could have painted it a few different colors, but I think it serves a purpose. So a lot of great things said here tonight, and really appreciate this discussion in general because it's so important that this happens. Was really hoping that there'd be a whole room full of community members here, but we're working with what we have. So,
thank you.
Is the chair?
Oh, is that right? Yeah.
And what's your last name?
Blaney, Blaney.
Thank you.
Thank you, appreciate it.
Thanks.
Hello. So my name is Megan Sparks, and I'm a member of the Affordable Housing Collaborative. I am a local real estate agent, and I also work for the Johnny Cake Center as a housing specialist. So I help a lot of local families who are in the moderate to low income level try to find housing in South Kingstown, Narragansett. And as you can imagine, especially with rentals these days, there aren't a lot of rentals, and the prices are unfortunately much higher than a lot of the families can afford. So what we've been seeing is a lot of families who have to move out of town. And the reason why I joined the Affordable Housing Collaborative is because I would like to help people or come up with some solutions to help these people stay in town. And a lot of them do work in the grocery stores, they work at Dunkin' Donuts, things like that. So I do think that there's a need for more affordable housing in our town and more options. Right now I just looked at a rental unit it was very nice. It was 750 square feet, 1.5 bedrooms, and it's $1,800. So you're seeing also, people competing for these rentals, and you're having 20 to 25 people applying. So, a lot of times people are just having a really hard time finding things. So I think there's definite need for more housing stock and more affordable housing as well.
Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Liz Karp, and I'm a member of the Affordable Housing Collaborative. I come at this with a little bit different viewpoint than the other people who just spoke. I'm a retired architect, and I've lived in town now in Wakefield for about 8 years. I moved down here from the Boston area where I raised my own children. to be near my grandchildren. And on the one hand, I have a daughter who is a single parent with two kids, like 10 and 12 years old, and she has been saving money to buy. And she's pretty much she's renting at an exorbitant rate, and she's a school teacher in the area for a private school. And she's pretty much said, I'm just going to keep saving my money because I can't afford a tiny little house that's no bigger than my rental that I have to pay $500,000 for, or buy a huge old house in Wakefield that have to put another $100,000 in that I don't have the money or the time to do it. So she's just sort of in this gap world and can't really afford anything. On the other hand, I live in a big old house that I adore in Wakefield that we bought, as I said, 8 years ago. But I'm starting to think, there's a lot of work. I love the house, but there's a lot of work. Okay, I'm not ready to think about assisted living yet, but if in 5 years, 8 years, I want to downsize, how do I do that? I'm retired. And I want to find a place I want to fix up, of course, so I need the extra money to fix it up. So, there's a lot of gaps here. I had originally thought about joining the Affordable Housing Collaborative for my architectural experience. I thought I could bring that, but I'm finding that it's so much bigger, and the depth of what we need to do is so much more than architecture. Yeah, things need to fit into the community, but the problem is so much bigger than I ever anticipated that it was. But I just want to comment on one thing, and that is South County Commons. I do find that just so disturbing on so many levels, and it's not the colors. Believe me, it's not the colors. It has no community feel. I haven't lived here that long, so I can't speak to what the intent was. And I go there, my gym is there, but I don't want to walk around. It bothers me that this is a cute little village, but I have to drive there and have to park my car. And so that, I would think it's a shame to duplicate that. But I want to thank you all. This was wonderful. I mean, I just keep reading things and trying to learn more and more about the community and what we can do to solve the problems. And it's just big. I mean, it's huge.
It is a huge problem, but I think one of the things you heard tonight from the board was the concern about fitting it into the community and fitting it into the neighboring property owners. So I think your expertise could lend a lot when you have discussions in the affordable, when we're talking about accessory dwelling units or cottage zonings and those types of things, and you're talking about that, don't be silent on those issues because you bring something to the table there.
Well, I have to tell you, and thank you, an interesting story. I live on Pond Street, right near the whole Larchwood issue. And right when we moved down here is when all of that came to a head. And because we were one of the abutters, there was this, and I don't know, my name was actually in the paper a number of times. We never received a notice as an abutter, so I had to get up and speak against the project. And that was one of the big issues is, yeah, it's great. I can roll down the hill if I ever need an Alzheimer's unit, but what's it going to do to the neighborhood? I mean, it's better having this empty space that's kind of falling apart a little bit. Some of the stone wall are coming apart. But the thought of having this enormous building, no matter what it is, functionally, this enormous building that comes out to the sidewalk all the way around that block is just terrifying. And it did meet zoning. That's the thing that's so scary. I mean, when we say zoning isn't the answer, I was actually on the zoning board outside in a suburb of Boston, and there were many projects that met the zoning regs, and it really became a legal issue. Does this meet the zoning regs? And there was so little thought given to the community's voices and the abutters' voices, and zoning's not the whole answer at all. But anyway, thank you.
Thank you. There are no other thoughts? Would someone like to make a motion to adjourn?
Could I offer one last thought?
Go ahead.
Is that okay? Very quick.
Sure. Yep.
One thing we didn't talk about tonight, and it's not part of any of our effort, but accessory dwelling units. Something to think about. If you allow for those, any house could suddenly add a second little unit behind it. It'll solve a ton of the student housing issues, creates opportunities for seniors, potentially if it's not above a garage, but done some other way. I think that's a low-hanging fruit that more communities should consider. It would be pretty easy just to say, okay, you've got a lot, you can add a second unit, put the regulations in place, how big it can be, et cetera. But it's an interesting way of letting everybody help solve the problem instead of trying to find the places where you can put a bunch, try to solve it in 3 spots.
I will say
we
the
do
town
allow
has
for
done. You have already really, really progressive ADU regulations in place, and I will remind you, you have in the docket some edits that we made last fall. So whenever you get around to addressing them as a body, I think there's some good things in there to improve it.
Take them even further, because a lot of times they say things like it's got to be a family member or something that applies to a very small percentage of families, right?
Yes, we're very much aware of that. We think that's an excellent tool, and we hope that the state doesn't use a heavy-handed approach and prevent any of our flexibility and creativity in furthering that effort.
Thank you. Spoke my piece.
Motion to adjourn unless someone has a comment? Second? All those in favor? Aye. Motion
Thank you
carries.
very much.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.